So just to mention in passing that this whole thing about morphing from becoming an adolescent, you can tell when children are becoming teenagers when they stop asking you where they came from and start refusing to tell you where they're going. But it is something that people notice because their bodies are changing very rapidly. They're feeling a bit out of control. And coming to terms with the physical and sexual changes of puberty are what set children apart during the adolescent years, these formative middle years of childhood, particularly 9 to 14, incredibly interesting time of life. But of course there's a lot going on underneath. All the things that are happening during adolescence are not just related to hormones, although the moodiness and the unpredictability, the volatility of young people at that time could have hormonal influences, but also the brain is developing, as you know. But consider just quietly this quote, because it's telling us something important as well. Adolescence is a time, writes Rachel Kessler in The Soul of Education, where the longings awaken with an intensity as many have misunderstood and dismissed as hormones. The larger questions about meaning, identity, responsibility and purpose begin to press with an urgency and loneliness we can all remember. This is really a time for wondering, who am I? Where do I fit? And adolescents desperately need a level of empathy. We have to close the empathy gap. We forget what it was like. Nature protects us from all the pain and suffering, if that's what it was. And we need to allow ourselves to remember what it was like to be a young person. The other issue that informs my interest and that of my colleagues in these years as an important time for healthcare and health promotion is that a lot of the problems are causing not only distress now, but are very costly in a monetary sense. Many of the problems of young people are preventable, psychosocial. They're to do with personal issues and relationships and concerns. And they're often the things that kids are reluctant to talk about unless they're in a relationship of trust. And also, many of the issues that are developing in adolescence are going to contribute to adult morbidity and mortality. So somebody once said that adolescents are either working out how to be in trouble with their health now or are defining the way in which they're going to be integrated later. So with that brief snapshot, looking more broadly really at the issues of growing up and the issues of coping with the normal developmental issues of adolescence, let's put a very strong spotlight on the question of growing up with illness. Now I'm just going to start with an offer to you. I'm feeling magnanimous and I'm going to offer you an all expenses paid holiday. You have three choices and I want you to consider the pros and cons of each. First choice is a weekend in Paris in a really nice hotel in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. It's a very nice part of Paris. The second one is a Caribbean cruise that will go for the course of a week. And the third opportunity for a holiday with a difference is an Antarctic tour to see the amazing animals of that region. Think about why you might choose one or the other. We can't dwell here because we can't interact quite that quickly. Now let's apply that exercise to choosing a health condition or a medical condition and think about why we might make that choice. Think of yourself as an adolescent at around 15. As I said, very formative time of life, very vulnerable time of life. The choices I want you to consider are, you can see a young man there in a wheelchair. You have mild spina bifida, a spinal condition. You do not have hydrocephalus, you do not have any intellectual deficit, but you do have problems with mobility. You're not wheelchair bound and you can walk with calipers and get around pretty well. One choice. Second choice is insulin-dependent diabetes coming on in early adolescence. Totally healthy during childhood, and now you're confronted with a condition with all sorts of implications, both immediate and longer term. Third choice is you have mild intellectual disability, developmental delay, but you are stunningly attractive and during adolescence. Now think about the choices. You have visibility, you have invisibility. Many medical students and nurses choose diabetes. A lot of research going into it eventually will nail that condition and make it possible to live completely normally, maybe with implants or immunotreatment or goodness knows what. But it does take a chunk of years off your life with complications hit in if your control hasn't been good. So there are pros and cons. As a person with spina bifida and intellectual normality, there's an awful lot you can do. But not being mobile and not being able to get around easily is a real bummer for young people, and they hate it. The milder your deficit, sometimes the more psychological distress associated with it. Think about having a slight developmental delay. There's nothing you can't do within your capacity, and you may be totally happy with your life, and of course you can have longevity to the 90s. Nothing can get in your way. But many people are reluctant to buy into that, which says something about the stigma of it, intellectual delay. And I want to talk a little bit about that too in a moment. But this is the reality. Chronic conditions keep kids affiliated with, attached to, sometimes reluctantly, the health system. And there's a lot of young people, children and young people with chronic and disabling conditions. With improved treatments, of course, most young people, 90% certainly, would be surviving into adult life. And survival rates have increased, giving us better longevity with things which used to be more difficult and life-limiting: congenital heart disease, renal disease, CF, a wonderful example, with better treatments from childhood, increasing survival. Some conditions are appearing with a greater incidence than in the past. Insulin-dependent diabetes is one of them, and of course secondary diabetes. But leukemia, inflammatory bowel disease, on the rise, not exactly sure why. Some disorders presenting earlier, and of course obesity of enormous concern as a preventable, theoretically preventable, major health risk for children, and kids who are fat in childhood and adolescence carry some morbidity factors with them into adult life. This is just to devil's advocate what we're concerned about in a public health or population health perspective. Obesity and overweight, 20%, incredible rate in Australia. Followed by asthma, and then eating disorders, also very high, carrying a lot of morbidity into adult life if not treated well, aggressively is what I'm referring to, and diabetes, CF and malignancy. All with different influences and impacts, as I've mentioned previously. And then a big chunk of the problems of young people are mental health issues. And it's easy to say 1 in 4 young people have a mental health problem. The healthcare analyst watching trends most carefully is a man by the name of Richard Eckersley. He's someone we have enormous respect for. He's so concerned that we're sacrificing young people on the altar of consumerism, individualism, imperialism. But he says, think of the fact that 127,000 young people in every 100,000, that's how we measure things in a population health perspective, 127,000 not travelling well, and of them many will have treatable conditions. The reality, though, is that not more than half of young people with mental health problems are diagnosed. Not more than a quarter of young people with mental health problems receive the help they need. So that's really giving us a little bit of a sense of the landscape that we're working in. Now, let's turn our attention in a generic way initially to the impact. And I asked you to think about what might be the special impact of 3 different conditions that I mentioned. And also asked you to think about your own situation and what you've experienced in your own life or through the lives of your children. Now, what we do know is that having a chronic and disabling condition does have an impact on you. Young people have lower levels of emotional well-being than their healthy peers. For obvious reasons, they have handicaps. Some are imposed by the way in which we treat them. Young people with illness can experience isolation, disconnectedness, have less of a say in their lives. And of course I should have mentioned that what young people want more than anything else is to be heard and to have a voice and to feel that they can influence their lives. And this is true whether or not you have health conditions. But some young people report alienation and incredible isolation, and I'm going to actually demonstrate recognising that in a moment. Absence from school, rigueur, often because of the need for treatment, and high risk of poor social adjustment. A lot of kids, for various reasons, end up getting to the point of having to transition out of paediatrics and child and adolescent health into adult care, not being really prepared to function as an independent adult, which unfortunately is expected of them in an adult environment. And of course, we're moving towards a conversation about child and youth-friendly environments. I wanted to particularly mention this because I think it's under our radar, the issues of children and young people with intellectual disability. We need to remember this is an underserved population too in many ways. They have higher morbidity, often very complex problems, lifestyle-related issues, particularly, as mentioned here, low fitness, obesity, deficient social skills, vulnerability, sexual exploitation, and barriers to accessing good services. Just also as a case example, I want to mention growing up with cancer as a very special burden. And of course you've got late effects and the morbidities that show up in adult life. But more importantly, for a young person to have their mortality in question, what a burden. And by the way, remember I asked you to look for art. This is a piece of art by Sophie Casser. It was part of a project called Growing Up with Cancer, conducted at the University of Sydney. I had the privilege of being involved in that. And young people with cancer or having had cancer and now being survivors were invited to depict their experience through art. And this is what Sophie did. She had bone cancer, took the scene, isolated place, but also a very beautiful place, and she drew her skeleton on this beautiful photograph of her body. So just think about that issue, which I think allows me at this moment to just mention the importance of art. In this quote, I'm very happy to share with you Thomas More in a book called Soulmates. He also wrote a beautiful book called Care of the Soul. Art, broadly speaking, he writes, is that which invites us into contemplation. In that moment of contemplation, art intensifies the presence of the world more vividly and more deeply. I think there is a very comfortable and important synergy between adolescent health and the arts. In fact, it's true at every stage of life that being able to access your right brain and your creativity is health-enhancing and well-being enhancing. I'll give you a very dramatic example. This young man who's given us permission to show his face is now in his 30s. He was 16 at the Children's Hospital at Camperdown and had the opportunity to do this painting we call Tear of Thought. And he depicts the faces of two old men, one fading into clouds and the other sinking into water. He and I went on a radio station and he, for the very first time, described the experience of felt that he was dying, that he was drowning, dying a suffocating death. Clearly he had cystic fibrosis and has done extremely well, but as an adolescent he was very fearful. And the vehicle for expressing his concerns was this painting represents the helplessness of life slowly fading away. The loss of identity, becoming something you once would not have recognised. There is a need for expression that comes from being trapped inside a world of inescapable sickness and hospitalisation. What an articulate statement. And also paying tribute to the fact that in the hospital where he was a resident for so many weeks and months of his life, there was the opportunity to use his talent. It was respected, valued, and encouraged.